Welcome to Research Methods. Today we'll be talking about ethics in psychological research. So why do we consider ethics in research? Well, when we're talking about ethics, we are doing this because we want to avoid harming people who are in our studies, and it's really important to think about this because if we don't, we might unintentionally do harm. We also want to think about our field holistically. If we don't have standards in place for all researchers, practitioners, etc., then we will not be retaining integrity of the field as a whole. Human subjects protection started after World War II, and this is because a number of unethical studies had been conducted that led people to realize that we needed to have safeguards in place. One of these was the Nazi medical war crimes that occurred from 1939 to 1945. Another was 1932 to 1972 Tuskegee syphilis study. And we won't talk about this today, but in 1971 there was a Stanford prison experiment, which is very famous, and I suggest that you look it up if you have not heard about it. So the first historical case that we'll talk about is the Nazi medical war crimes, and this consisted of medical experiments that were performed on concentration camp prisoners during the Holocaust. This involved injecting people with gasoline and live viruses, immersing people in ice water, forcing people to ingest poisons. Intentional harm and exploitation of a vulnerable population are the two aspects of this research that really make it unethical. And as a result of this realization, the Nuremberg Code was written in 1945. Now, this was the first international code of research ethics defining what was legal and what was not in human subjects research. So, really pivotal time in human subjects research internationally. Another study that was conducted is the Tuskegee syphilis study. It's really well known, and you've likely heard of it. This spanned from 32 to 72. It was a 40-year observational study of Black men with and without syphilis, and it was voluntary, but it was not research that was conducted after receiving informed consent. It's worth noting that this study was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service, so the U.S. government, and the motivation was good, the intent was good. The aim was to observe the natural course of syphilis in Black men as a means of justifying programs that would address this problem. However, there were at least a few unethical aspects of this research, one of which was the participants were given incentives like free medical exams, meals, burial insurance, but not compensation for their participation. They were told that the study was, that they were being treated for bad blood, quote unquote. And bad blood is sort of local terminology that encompasses, yes, syphilis, but also a couple of other more benign conditions such as anemia and fatigue, which aren't necessarily benign, but they're certainly far less serious than syphilis in most cases. And they were told that the study would last 6 months, but as I mentioned, it was a 40-year observational study. Now, perhaps most egregiously, when penicillin emerged as the treatment of choice for syphilis, participants were not systematically informed of this or offered the option to leave the study in pursuit of treatment. That's terrible. It's really quite shameful that this was conducted by the U.S. government. So if we can't presume that our government will adhere to ethical standards, then we can't necessarily presume that anybody will be. Hence, the need for a really thoughtful and clear ethical code. This triggered the Belmont Report in 1979. So the Belmont Report established basic ethical principles that should guide biomedical and behavioral research involving human subjects. All studies with human subjects are meant to adhere to these guidelines, which were issued by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The basic ethical principles that comprise the Belmont Report are respect for persons, so that implies autonomy. Things like the participants should be well aware of what they're participating in so that they can make an independent, autonomous, informed decision about whether or not to participate. They should be able to stop their involvement if they want to. There's also beneficence, which means it's coming from Latin. So if you're looking at the roots there, you've got bene, which means good or well, and ficens comes from the verb to do or to make. So we want to do good as researchers and maximize benefits and minimize harms associated with our studies. We also want for our research to be just. We want to treat each person equally in a way that dignifies them. The APA ethics code today is really what psychologists in this profession use as a form of guidance when it comes to ethics in our discipline. And so this code is comprised of principles, which are sort of objectives, aspirational, broad guidance, whereas the standards are rules that we must follow. So the principles consist of principles A through E. You've got beneficence and non-maleficence, so doing good and not doing bad, not doing harm, fidelity and responsibility, integrity, justice, respect for people's rights, and dignity. So these are the really 5 pillars of the ethics code, kind of overarching guidance for us. There was more recent than the Nazi and Tuskegee studies, ethical violation that was the result of the American Psychological Association's activities, actually. Uh, there were top officials in the APA who sort of twisted and turned ethics policies to justify the involvement of psychologists in refining and expanding methods of torture. Really egregious and was covered by the media. You could access an article by Daniel Griffin in the Huffington Post. Click the link in the PowerPoint if you'd like to read that, or just Google it. And that ends this segment, but if you follow the next link, we will talk about multicultural considerations in psychological ethics research.